Everything we know about the War of 1812 from school textbooks is a surprisingly smooth and well-polished story. Army movements are described with precision down to the meter. Troop numbers are known almost by name, and the thoughts of the commanders have been preserved for posterity in the smallest detail. It creates a strange feeling, as if someone knew in advance how everything would unfold, or wrote the script after the fact. For an era without satellites or the internet, such documentary perfection looks suspicious, to say the least. To understand this, we have to temporarily abandon the usual perspective and look at history through a completely different lens. We're talking about three concepts that official science tends to avoid. First, the non-linearity of time, where the past, present, and future can intersect at a single point in reality. Second, the merging and overlapping of worlds, when different layers of reality leave traces that don't fit the familiar picture. And third, the presence of non-human civilizations, traces of which we usually dismiss as myths and legends. Only with such tools can we attempt to explain the numerous mysteries that abound in our history. If you find this interesting, support the channel with a like and subscribe. Real archives of secrets await us ahead. Immediately after the war with Napoleon ended, a wave of monument construction began across the Russian Empire, dedicated to the heroes of 1612. The famous monument to Minin and Pozharsky in Moscow was erected in 1818. But if you look closely at it, questions arise. Ancient features in the clothing, poses, and style, the shape of the pedestal, a monolith with lids, processed as if using technologies that officially simply didn't exist at the time. The sculptor is said to be Ivan Martos, who created dozens of similar antique sculptures. Almost all of his works are done in a style that seemingly has no place in Russia at the beginning of the 19th century. Medals issued to commemorate the victory over Napoleon are another anomaly. Russian warriors on them are often depicted in Roman armor, and the composition is everywhere accompanied by the symbol of the all-seeing eye. Why were such images chosen? Where did the traditional Russian forms disappear to if the events were still so fresh in memory? A similar oddity is the monument in Kazan, erected in 1813 to commemorate the capture of Kazan, which happened in 1552. Why remember events from 260 years earlier at that particular moment? It creates the impression that a significant number of so-called historical artifacts, from sculptures to coins, were simply found and later attached to convenient figures and eras. The true authors and the time of their creation remain in question. These things may belong to a different civilization, one that either existed before us or developed parallel to the official chronology. We inherited them and rewrote them for ourselves. St. Petersburg, with its granite embankments, columns, and buildings that seem unreal for its time, falls into the same mysterious category. A city that seems not built, but excavated. These stones hold the memory of something greater than just a war, and when you start to look closely at them, you realize that on the surface lies only the schoolbook narrative. Russia, Alexander I, the heroic retreat, the burning of Moscow, the victory over Napoleon. But dig a little deeper and questions arise that cause the familiar outline of history to begin to blur, and it's no longer so obvious who was actually fighting whom and for what. What if the War of 1812 wasn't a war between Russia and France at all, but a coordinated operation by Alexander I and Napoleon against a third force? Against Muscovy, or, as it's sometimes called in alternative circles, Tartaria. We're not talking about that exotic Tartaria shown on old maps, but about the Eastern Russian world, rooted in the Vedic tradition, with a different structure, culture, and line of power tracing back to the Ruriks and the ancient boyars. In fact, it's about the redistribution of power and territory within the so-called Russian Empire. The Romanovs' vector of expansion went from Petersburg along waterways deep into the continent, towards the Volga. That's why, in the 18th and 19th centuries, canals were built at an unprecedented speed. Fortresses were strengthened. Internal troops were created, censorship was tightened, and the Ministry of Police was introduced. All of this was to consolidate control over conquered lands. The history of conquests is masked as internal reforms, peasant unrest, and other convenient narratives. But in reality, it was about eliminating the old elite and rewriting historical memory. The troops of Alexander I and Napoleon on the battlefield differed only in the color of their uniforms, green and blue. Napoleon himself is repeatedly depicted in portraits wearing a green uniform, as if emphasizing their commonality. The commanders in both armies were half foreigners, with surnames that are hard to call Russian. Alexander's orders were published in French. The medals, awards, and architecture of the victory monuments, everything is done in a purely Western style. It seems the armies were simply dressed in different uniforms to destroy their common past. But if this was the case, where else on the planet was something similar happening at the same time? June 1812. Napoleon enters Russia. And in the same month, almost simultaneously, a war begins in North America between the United States and Great Britain. Officially, it's considered insignificant. But it was this war that initiated the clearing of the continent of its indigenous population and the massive seizure of territories. Very similar to what was happening in Russia. Territorial cleansing, the disappearance of old cultures, the rewriting of history. It creates the impression of a global reformatting of the world, where official history serves merely as a convenient facade. Perhaps the 19th century wasn't just an era of wars, but the time of the final great changing of the scenery. And those who remembered the past simply ceased to exist. And all that's left is architecture, artifacts, monuments, things with too much antiquity in them to be Russian. The world was being reshaped according to a single template. But who was the client? And what technologies allowed this to be done so quickly and on such a scale? The answer may lie not on the ground, but in the sky. There's a theory that about 300 years ago, a large-scale cleansing took place on Earth, the consequences of which remain beyond the understanding of most. Many have heard versions about the Anunnaki, reptilians, and other highly developed entities supposedly controlling humanity since ancient times. It doesn't matter what you call them. The main point is that there's a struggle for influence on Earth, and human history is just a reflection of a conflict between higher forces, succeeding each other as masters of the planet. The victorious force destroys the traces of the previous one, rewrites the chronicles, reformats the architecture, and suppresses the remnants of inconvenient technologies. There are enough examples from human history. After conquests, chronicles are rewritten, palaces are torn down, new temples are built on the sites of old sanctuaries. Only on a global scale this would happen at a continental level. According to one version, between the 15th and 19th centuries, a global war took place, the scale of which wasn't just interstate, but intercivilizational. It wasn't just a battle for Moscow, but the final stage of cleansing a once existing, highly developed civilization. Possibly the very one that left behind megalithic cities and inexplicable technologies. And, as some believe, St. Petersburg in its nearly finished state. The infrastructures of the past world were being destroyed. Old cities, technological artifacts, energy and communication systems. They were destroyed massively and quickly, using plasma and nuclear weapons, possibly from the air. One argument supporters of this hypothesis use is old engravings and paintings depicting aerial anomalies resembling unidentified objects or plasma balls, flying fortresses, strange beams falling from the sky. Some artists of the past literally painted battles in the sky with objects clearly unlike birds or clouds. Many such images are officially considered symbolic allegories or religious motifs, but look at them differently and the picture changes. Why did artists paint things that didn't exist? Or were they there, but didn't make it into the textbooks? Perhaps we are the descendants of the survivors. Or maybe we were created anew. The remaining artifacts from the former world are scattered across museums and catacombs, and official science stubbornly refuses to acknowledge their inconsistency with the chronology. It turns out we live among the ruins of a world of giants. The empire that was destroyed left us the palaces of Petersburg and the granite embankments as an inheritance. We are not the builders of this world. We are the descendants of survivors who found ready-made cities and declared themselves their creators. Official history is just a thin layer of plaster on the powerful wall of an ancient civilization. Our task is to learn to see these seams and ask questions. 1812 is not a starting point, but the finale of a long and forgotten war for our planet. If this video made you think, support the channel with a like so we can keep digging. And now, pay attention to the screen. 2 other investigations of ours have appeared there. They will change your view of history even more and show where else the traces of that great battle for our world are hidden.